Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Rambling On podcast. I'm hoping to get this episode done and released in January, so 2 in a month. The aim is to do 2 episodes in 1 month. However, obviously these things take time. As I've said before, I'm still learning the content creation and the editing. And the recording, in fact, all takes quite a while for me to get done. So I'm really just still finding my feet, very much so, as will be apparent in the episode, or the coming episodes as well, to be honest. So anyway, episode 3, and this is the tribalism of party politics. As always, the focus will be in the United Kingdom, because that's where I have the knowledge of, and I live here, so I'm aware of the system that is in the UK. Now, this will obviously be applicable to other countries around the world. However, I simply haven't lived there, so I cannot speak extensively about it. And if I can't, I won't, because I don't want to make a fool of myself, quite frankly. So, how the system works in the United Kingdom, very briefly now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but how it works in the United Kingdom is we have what is called a constitutional monarchy. This is where the monarch is the head of state. So our monarch currently is Charles III. However, the real power lies in the elected officials, known as the government or His Majesty's government. So whoever the whoever the monarch is, they're certainly not elected. The government effectively answers to them. However, depending on the gender of the monarch will be the pronoun. So it's currently His Majesty's government because Charles, but when it was Elizabeth, it was Her Majesty's government. So with that out of the way. So the government is headed by the Prime Minister, who's currently Rishi Sunak. But in general, he/she will have a select number of MPs who are members of Parliament, and they will take those MPs and they will form a cabinet. And these MPs who are in a cabinet are known as ministers. So whenever you hear like senior ministers, it'll probably be cabinet members, or there are some rankings within the system of politicians, but anyway, we'll not get into that. So the history of the Parliament in the UK can't actually be pinned down to a specific day, where there was a defined transition from a monarchy to a democracy that took place. Like most things in the UK, as if you do live here, you'll probably know, or if you listen to this enough, you'll get to know. In the UK, both now and in the past, things are a lot more convoluted than simply a day of transition. And we were this one day and we were something else the next. So to summarise our parliamentary past, I thought it would be accurate to state that its birth was not a product of political machinations of any, democratically inclined lords, aristocrats, or even the peasantry way back in history. Rather, it was a happy consequence of changes that were constantly evolving during the English landscape. Changes that especially took place when certain monarchs flew too close to the sun, so to speak. So as always, let me start by delving into the history of the English Parliament, which is obviously now the modern day British Parliament. So many people attribute the origins of the Parliament to the famous Magna Carta document signed in 1215 by King John. Involuntarily, by the way, he was one such king who flew too close to the sun, which stated that the monarch would have some limit of his power, or some of his power was limited at least, and it established certain legal rights for the subjects of the realm, so the people. But when it says the subjects of the realms, it wasn't really the people as such. It was mainly just the wealthy people who wanted to maintain their power, which King John, they thought, was abusing. However, it's not entirely accurate to say that the idea of Parliament. This is when the idea of Parliament was first conceived. To get a more complete summary of parliamentary procedures in England, we need to go further back to the Anglo-Saxons. Now, for those who don't know who the Anglo-Saxons are, they were effectively settlers from Saxony, Anglia, and Jutland, which is modern-day Denmark/Germany, who migrated to Britain and settled here. And they essentially replaced the local Romano-British/Celtic population. Somewhat, anyway, not entirely. But as a side note, whether this was done by force or by peaceful means is up for debate amongst the contemporary historians, as some believe it was a natural assimilation of a new culture, whilst others contend that once they came over, they realised, and by they I mean the Anglo-Saxons, they realised that the local populace wasn't very capable of defending themselves, and they made the, shall we say, executive decision of claiming the land for themselves without the consent of the locals. Anyway, the Anglo-Saxons brought about their form of governing the land, and it was somewhat different from how it was done in Roman Britain. Now, obviously, just as well to add a bit of context to this, the Romans had their own way of governing. They were a republic. They were later on an empire, and then they collapsed. But anyway, so how it was done differently from how it was done in Roman Britain. Once the Anglo-Saxons had established kings across the land, which was known as the Heptarchy, which was essentially the 7 petty kingdoms in England. They formed, again, taking the traditions from continental mainland, they formed the Witan, which was essentially the king and his advisors. So the history of the Witan likely dates back, or it does date back, to the tribal traditions brought over from Europe, and of the places mentioned, and also other places within Germany as well, and Denmark. So the Witan is actually short for Wittengemot, which is Old English. I think it's Wittengemot anyway, could be pronouncing that wrong. Where Witan means to know or to advise, and Gemot means a meeting or an assembly. So, who were the members of the Witan? Well, obviously, first and most importantly, was the king. And then the king would then include in the Witan his most trusted advisors and also other powerful nobles in his kingdom, who typically included the bishops, the thanes, and the aldermen. Their primary aim or goal or reason was to be, the raison d'etre was to be the loyal advisors to the king. But whilst the king did have ultimate authority, there was an understanding between the king and his advisors that power balance needed to be struck, and the king should heed the advice of the Witan, and the Witan should respect that the king has ultimate authority. However, if the king were to disregard them too often, there would likely be, and indeed there were, political consequences for the king. And you could look at it the other way. If the Witan or certain individuals in the Witan got too powerful, the king was able to, punish them effectively. Another key role the Witan played, or one key role that the Witan played, was to choose, or maybe more accurately, approve the next king. So once the incumbent died, they would have the authority to say who they thought should be the next king. So they couldn't just pick any random person to be king. It wasn't like, okay, we're going to find someone who will do our bidding. No. They would have had to have picked someone from the bloodline of the royal family. So it's an important role they play. But in addition to this role, these members of the Witan were also responsible for ensuring the land that they had control over in the petty kingdom was governed. So the land that was governed by them, because obviously the king wasn't able to centrally control the whole kingdom, even though it was a small, there were 7 petty kingdoms, and England is small enough. So if you divvy that up into 7 smaller kingdoms, but even then, a king would not be able to control all of that. So that was left. The day-to-day runnings was left to the ealdormen or the thanes. I think the ealdormen were the ones who were in control of the bits of land divvied up by the king. So things like taxes, the laws, maintaining law, land cultivation, and just other daily oversight of the land. I think a lot of the things they would have to do is sit in court and just listen to people and their problems and their issues and resolve them. They would also be called up to support the king in times of war if the king needed soldiers, as and when required, really. But I would say probably most importantly is that they were, or one of the main responsibilities of them would to be able to approve the next king. Now, there is a debate amongst historians as to whether this procedure was a purely ceremonial one, or whether they actually had authority to choose, to choose and deny a king. I think this can be likened to the idea of, the king in the United Kingdom today, or politicians, have to get the monarch's approval. Now, whether they are actually reliant on the king's approval or not, I think is up for debate, because I think technically they are, but if the king were to say no, then I think it could be overruled. So it's one of those situations where people aren't entirely sure. So yes, most importantly though, or the key takeaway, I should say, was that they were powerful individuals, and if you were to make a like-for-like comparison, they would be the equivalent of, lords or viscounts, etc., of England that were introduced by the North. In fact, actually, the ealdormen, they would be the earls. I believe it was the earls that essentially replaced the aldermen. And if I could be wrong with this statement, but I believe that it was the earls who were the sort of highest of the nobility. Or maybe it was a duke. I can't remember. It's either a duke or an earl that's one of the highest. But anyway, the ealdormen were sort of replaced by earls, and you can actually kind of, if you spell them both out, because ealdorman is spelled with EALDORMAN, and an earl is EARL. So ealdorman, earl, they're quite similar. So that's the best comparison that can be made. So there are some similarities to a parliament, in the sense that it was not the king's absolute choice to decide all the rules of the land. There was an element of democracy, whereby a select few individuals could decide some things, or at least had an element of choice on some things. However, the ealdormen were lords of their holding. In other words, they were basically mini kings, and they weren't voted in by the people who lived in their areas of control, and the regular people still didn't have a say. So democracy may be a stretch. I think it'd be more accurate just to say it was more of an oligarchy. What we would have today would be an oligarchy. But the Witans were a lot less organised, and there wasn't a fantastic element of procedure with them. They didn't have consistent meeting times, for example, or meeting locations, actually. And they could only actually gather when the king called them. So it was back then, it was very, as and when we'll kind of decide, nothing set in stone. But that's the Witan, in a nutshell, very brief. And that is sort of the Anglo-Saxons' rudimentary take on a parliament. Now, every British person, and I assume French person, although now I say that out loud, I wonder if this date is as big for French people as it is for Brits. Anyway, that would be nice to know though. So if anyone is French, and let me know, or I might ask some of my French friends actually. Anyway, so 1066 is a key date in British history, as this is the year that William the Conqueror became King of England after defeating Harold Hardrada in the famous Battle of Hastings. And when William ascended the crown and later secured the country against the loyal Anglo-Saxons rebelling against the new king, he brought in a number of key changes that would completely change the country for good, and would actually still have an impact today. And one of those, which in fact does still have a lasting effect today, was how the country was run under the new Norman rule. As I said before, many of the Anglo-Saxon ealdormen were replaced by their Norman counterparts. And as such, the Witan was, by default, replaced under the new administration, and the Norman equivalent of the Witan was the King's Curia Regis. They met 3 times a year under William, and this was at Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide. So what the Normans became famous for was the introduction of the feudal system into the United Kingdom, which lasted for quite some time, from 1066 onwards. And the feudal system was effectively a more centralised method of ruling the country, whereby the land was distributed amongst the earls and the other lords, which created a system of land tenure, essentially, and this land tenure allowed the king to solidify his control over the whole country. Under this new tenurial system, the king owned all of the land. However, he couldn't just keep the land for himself. So even though he is the king, William, the ultimate power in the land, there is again a balance that exists and that needs to be struck between the king and his closest subordinates. If he upsets them all at once, they have the military and economic power to defeat him. So being aware of this, he needs to maintain their loyalty. So what he does, he divvies up the land. Of course, he keeps a large portion of the land for himself. He distributes some of the land to the church, which was also essential because the church was actually more powerful than the king. Because the church, sort of had the ultimate authority of kings. The church was the king of kings, essentially, because it was, they were representing God and they were chosen by God. So, giving land to the church was very important. And then, so after that, he gave the rest of the land to the Norman lords. So it's recorded that the land that he granted was actually to fewer than 180 men, which just goes to show sort of how small, for the whole of England, 180 men owned all the land. So, yeah. So the similarities you can see between the Norman rule and the Anglo-Saxon rule was that these earls would govern the land on behalf of the king, and they would swear an oath to the king, and they would provide troops in times of war. So in that sense, not too dissimilar. So for any of those who fancy themselves as political philosophers, or if you are in fact a political philosopher, highly unlikely, but if you are, I think an interesting observation about how monarchs ruled the land is that despite the fact that the country was run entirely centrally, the king actually still needed to distribute the administration of the land to other people, which just goes to show that completely centralized government or rule is almost impossible to achieve, because there are just so many things happening at once that for one person to maintain, or if you think in the case of communism, a group of people to maintain, it's completely unfeasible. So by divvying up the country and giving lords of the land that they maintain themselves, the everyday running of the land, the responsibility is taken away from the king, who, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to manage the land anyway. Now, on a smaller scale, one might argue that while, how did the earls manage the land centrally that they were given? Because effectively it's just the same thing, a king on a smaller scale. So, well, how did the earls do it? And the answer is, well, then the earls would distribute their land to the minor lords, who were in charge of running a smaller portion of the land. So this wasn't a democracy, and if anything, it is still quite centralized. But if you think about the essence of centralization, it's very difficult to achieve, and a better way of running it, instead of just having one person look after it all, as the land is looked after itself by the people. Anyway, so it's not a democracy, but it does highlight the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of having a centralized government making decisions on behalf of the whole country. But another important change that the Normans make when they replace the Anglo-Saxons is the beginning of what is a two-tiered parliamentary system, which also still exists today. And by the way, when I said before that the Anglo-Saxons, there were questions about whether it was peaceful or whether it was not. With the Normans, it was violent because it was battles, and then they crushed rebellions. And then when they arrived here, it was the Normans who were the higher upper class aristocrats, and they were the ones speaking French, and then the lower class was the Anglo-Saxons. So there was still a divide. However, eventually, over time, they did sort of assimilate into one group. So they're just two different methods of governing there. So what the two-tier parliamentary system means is that there was a handful of the highest-ranking nobles who were given the largest portions of land, as I mentioned before, 180. So they were given the land from the king, and they were the primary tier. And then a much larger but minor group of landowners, who were called the gentry, they were not actually given the land by the king, but the barons and the earls, who were given the land by the king. So they those 180 get given the land, and then those 180 decide from there who would get that land. And when I say, so the two-tiered parliamentary system would have been the Lords, and then the House of Lords, and then the MPs. That's still sort of the idea. We have sort of a two-tiered parliamentary system, even though the Lords they have no power apart from vetoing. The Lords back then obviously had a lot more influence. So the barons and the earls, they had a lot more privileges than the poor gentry, who only got a smidge of land. But they also had, these barons and earls, they also had more responsibility. They sat at the king's court, and they were often either his biggest ally or enemy, which is accurate to say because there were many treacherous dealings in court that took place over English history. Now, I'm cautious of going into any more detail about the Normans or about how the Normans changed life in England from 1066 onwards, because there is so much that can be said for what they did, from the judicial system to taxation to the architecture, all the way down to the local level of, what a shire and 100 was. So for those who are intrigued by the changes the Normans brought about into Anglo-Saxon England, one of the best sources I can suggest is actually by a gentleman called David Crowther, who has a podcast called the History of England podcast, which frankly is a frighteningly detailed chronicle of English history. I mean, this man examines English history under a microscope. To give an example of the sort of things he touches on, so he talks about the land surveying methods of the Anglo-Saxons, and gives a defence to why the method in which the Anglo-Saxons measured land the way they did compared to how it's done now. So, he's going into incredible detail, just about everything. So a great source for history, for historical context. And there are many other sources out there as well, by the way. He's not the only one. But that's, if you want a complete, ultimate history of England, he's the man. David Crowther, History of England. And also, that's not, I'm not like paid to do this or anything, obviously, because no one's actually listening to this. I don't actually know. Well, David Crowther has no idea who I am. And to be honest, I don't even know what he looks like. So this is not like some sort of, paid promotion. The reason, I just say that is because I've listened to his podcast, not all of it. He's been doing it since 2013, and I think he's only at like the 17th century. But to me, he's like this great omnipotent oracle who provides wisdom for us mere ignorant, feeble mortals. Anyway, one of the most important developments of early Norman rule, which some may argue is in fact the foundation of our, and in fact the world's, modern democracy, is a document, as I mentioned before, called the Magna Carta. Some may have heard this term before, but you might not really know what it means, so let me quickly talk about it. So the Magna Carta, which is Latin for the Great Charter, was originally issued in 1215 during the reign of King John of England. And what it was a response to the oppressive rule of King John, who was faced with significant discontent amongst the barons and the nobles of England. The document aimed to effectively address the various issues and grievances that they had and establish certain principles of justice to the people and limit the power of the royal. And again, when I say people, I think it's important to note here that it's not everyone. It's not the peasants, the farmers. It's the wealthy landowners and the earls and the barons. Just to make that clear. So they wanted to give the wealthy people certain principles and enforce the limitations on royal power. So the discontent amongst the nobles that led to the creation of the Magna Carta, as I said, was derives from various issues that were done by King John. So heavy taxation. He was basically taxing a lot of the nobles to fund his military campaigns, and a lot of the campaigns were the territories in France, and a lot of this financial burden fell on the nobles. And on that topic of military campaigns in France, he lost a lot of them. They were largely unsuccessful, and England lost a lot of territory in France, which he wanted to try and reclaim. So he wanted to spend more money, and he kept on losing, and it just wasn't going very well for poor King John. And they were, the nobles were frustrated. They were losing men, and they sort of saw the war as meaningless. He was also known for abusing his rights slightly. He would exploit his position to extract fees from the nobility. He would unfairly seize their estates without any legal justification, and that element of trust was gone between the king and his loyal subjects, so the barons and the earls. And yeah, he was just he was well known for not following the procedures that had been set up. The rule of law. He was abusing the rule of law, and if you don't have the rule of law, then what do you have? And other things, he was just known to be quite rude. They didn't like him. He would not include them in his decisions. As I was saying before, with regards to the Anglo-Saxons, the king had to heed the advice of his loyal subjects, and King John didn't do that. And also he had disputes with the church. As I said, the church is very powerful. They're more powerful than the king. So he's basically did everything that a king shouldn't do. And as such, he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which was a very important document, because what it did, it like I said, it laid the protection rights. So they're called the protection of feudal rights. This is what's taken from online. The Magna Carta sought to protect the feudal rights of the barons and nobles. Again, note how it's just the barons and the nobles, not everyone else. And it was to stop the king's ability to levy arbitrary taxes, and ensured that legal procedures were followed before any confiscation of property. Anyway, so that's sort of, a lot of the nuances about the Magna Carta. It's a very important document, and it's, if you want to read more about it, what it did, then please do. It's plenty of things out there to sort of give you good information about that. So, earlier on I mentioned how even though the king has ultimate power within the country, his power is balanced out by his subordinates. And so that's where it sort of comes into play. So the Magna Carta, what it did is it laid the foundations, and over the centuries this document was built on to provide more liberty to people. Again, not the farmers, but the lords, which is unfortunate, but that's just how it was back then. So from the Anglo-Saxons to the Normans, beyond, we're starting to see a slow shift towards a slightly more democratic nation, although still very far off what we have today. Now, if we skip a few decades, we land at the first time a parliament is formally created in England. This is known as Simon de Montfort's Parliament. Simon de Montfort, a nobleman, led a rebellion against King Henry III. As a result, he called a parliament in 1265 that, interestingly enough, and quite revolutionary at the time, not only included nobles and clergymen, but also commoners, which is very, very strange for the time. However, this parliament didn't last, unfortunately. Then we had Edward I and his model parliament of 1295. This is seen as a landmark event, and it is a landmark event, because it included representatives from counties and boroughs, in addition to the traditional nobility and clergy. And it's probably important to note that when I say commoners in Simon de Montfort's one, they were still knights, and so they were like petty lords. So again, obviously that's not the farmers, because when you read about this, you think, wow, it's the normal people. No, it's not normal people. They're still titled people, shall we say. But anyway, so the structure of Edward I's model parliament became a template for future parliamentary gatherings. That's sort of what they used to base the parliamentary procedures on in the future. And it was from this that we essentially based our modern parliamentary system on as well. Okay, so now let's skip a few centuries. Not because they're unimportant in any way, but because they're just not particularly relevant to this episode. But plenty of important things did happen throughout those decades for sure. But we skip a few centuries and we land at the English Civil War. Bloody hell. Now, I think this part of English and actually British history is strange because it's actually quite important. It's an important part of our history, but it's just not spoken about that much. And I'm honestly not entirely sure why. And even I'll be the first to admit that my knowledge of the English Civil War lacks any serious depth. But in fairness, it is quite a complicated period in British history, which could be a reason why. But nonetheless, it's quite important, especially regarding the parliamentary history of the United Kingdom. The reason it's so important is because it further democratised the country and further limited the power of the monarch and placed more power in Parliament. So the Civil War, the English Civil War, took place in 1642. But in fact, it wasn't as simple as one civil war, of course. As I said before, nothing is simple in Britain. It was actually 3 different civil wars in 3 different countries, England, Scotland and Ireland. And to add another complexity of a layer of complexity to it, it wasn't between 2 sides, it was between 4. The Royalists, the Catholics, the Protestants and the Parliamentarians. And it went on, and it was very confusing, and a lot of people died. And the king, King Charles I of England, Ireland, he was actually the king of England, Ireland and Scotland. He was beheaded, so on and so forth. As civil wars do, they get very complicated, and added to the fact that it's in Britain, it's even more complicated. But the significant outcome of this rather confusing debacle was that Oliver Cromwell, love him or hate him, established the Commonwealth. He became Lord Protector of this new Commonwealth and had ended England's long history of a monarchical regime and replaced it with a republic. Spoiler alert. Obviously, as we can all guess, this didn't last very long and the monarchy was restored. And that's known as the Restoration period. And in that, Charles I's son, aptly named Charles II, was king. But some of the key changes that Cromwell had made was the fact that he replaced the Rump Parliament, who were themselves the result of a purge of politicians who disagreed with the new model army known as the Grandees. A new model because they were a new sort of type of army. Cromwell thought that this parliament were useless and installed a much smaller group of men called the Parliament of the Saints, who were supposedly very deeply moral men. If people are unfamiliar with Cromwell, he was someone who... he's quite a divisive figure in history because he's seen as a very unfun person, to put it lightly. But he was very, devout and moral and very strict. If you can imagine, like, someone from the Middle Ages, very strict and very pious, etc. So, anyway, Cromwell died. And weirdly enough, much like a monarchy, his son inherited the role of Lord Protector of the New Republic. Nothing to see here, folks. Now, his son had a very brief tenure as well before he stepped away and the Rump Parliament was returned. And then not too long after that, all the previous ousted politicians were reinstated. And the reason for this was to avoid another war that was coming on the horizon, because at this point there had been many battles fought and lost. I'm glossing over this a lot. Because there's just so much and it would take me a couple episodes to get through this. So anyway, with the restoration of the monarch in place, this also ended what is known as the Long Parliament, which had been in session since 1662. So The key outcomes of the Civil War was that the power of the monarchy was reduced further so as to not repeat the unfavourable events of the Civil War, and more independence of Parliament from the king. The Parliament maintained or gained more independence from the king, from the rule of the monarch. The changes in Parliament weren't quite done yet, however, as we later had the Glorious Revolution, which was the name given to it not by the enthusiasm of parliamentary change. Anyway, this was where King James II was overthrown by William III, King Billy and the Battle of the Boyne, who introduced the Bill of Rights in 1689, which were very significant in shifting the power of governing the country from the monarchy to Parliament. And this really laid the most solid foundation for the constitutional monarchy that we have today. And during this time, the two political parties had emerged. And this, when I say during this time, I mean during the Glorious Revolution. Two political parties emerged, and they were the Whigs, spelt WHIGS, and the Tories, who obviously people know who the Tories are. The Tories are the Conservatives. Funnily, I think they were both originally slanderous terms. A Whig was a horse thief and was later used to refer to those who were non-conformist and rebellious. A Tory was an Irish term for a papist outlaw, and was applied to those who supported the hereditary right of King James. Now, the Tories largely became associated with being in favour of the monarchy as an absolute monarchy. They were in favour of the Church of England, and they supported the interests of the landed aristocracy. So effectively, they were against radical change. They wanted to keep, things the same. However, they did eventually adopt the Whiggish policy of a constitutional monarchy. So it wasn't too long before they moved away from the idea of a absolute monarchy. The Whigs, on the other hand, had always been in favour of limiting the power of the monarchy by advocating a constitutional monarchy. They also represented the growing industrial middle class and were more religiously tolerant, let's say. Now, obviously, the Tory party still exists today as the Conservatives, who we will discuss later, whereas the Whigs technically don't exist today, although some claim that they are now the Liberal Democrats and also parts of Labour, but effectively they're not in power anymore. And this is why, as well, people consider the Conservative Party to be the most successful political party on earth because they've been around for so long. Okay, so that concludes what was supposed to be a small introduction to this episode, and actually, I remember now why I lack any significant knowledge of the English Civil War period, because I don't like learning about the English Civil War period. I think it's terribly confusing, and I think so many events happen in such close proximity to each other, and because I'm not a supercomputer, I can't keep up with everything. So that is why I glossed over that. If you are egotistical enough to learn more about this fourth dimensional labyrinth of history, then go right ahead. Bletchley Park might have a vacancy for you if you can make any sense of it. But the reason I gave that background knowledge is because I wanted to show how much of a history England and the UK has had in terms of parliamentary change, and how we're here today because of what happened over almost 1,000 years. What we are today is stuff that's taken place over 1,000 years, And of course, there are other places that have even richer histories of democracy or democratic foundations. Most famously, the Romans and the Greeks before them. They have, they're one of the first empires to introduce the idea of a democracy. So, anyway, in the UK today, we have a total of 408 registered political parties, which was actually a shock to me, because I thought it would be a lot less. Although it's probably worth noting that a lot of these will only have a few hundred supporters and no actual seats in Parliament, obviously. But even so, 408 is a lot. But I would say the most influential political parties in the UK today are the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP or the Scottish Nationalist Party, the Green Party, the Democratic Unionist Party, which is the DUP in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin, also in Northern Ireland, and Plaid Cymru in the Party of Wales. So the SNP, the SNP, Sinn Féin, and Plaid Cymru are all parties that are from devolved governments, so from England. No, not from England, from Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. However, I think a more accurate description of the political landscape in the United Kingdom is that the country is split between two parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But as I mentioned, the SNP are very popular in Scotland, Plaid, popular in Wales, Sinn Féin and the DUP are popular in Northern Ireland. The main issue that the United Kingdom, I believe, faces today is the fact that many people have an unwavering loyalty to the political parties instead of ideas. And that brings about a number of problems. To give an example, if you were engaged in a discussion with someone and they ask you, do you support Labour, for example, and you responded, no, they would automatically assume that you were a Conservative. And this has in fact happened to me on several occasions, where people have automatically assumed that because I'm not one, I'm the other. So, why is that an issue? Well, ultimately, having two political parties breeds mediocre politicians with no real ambition to do right by the country. But more importantly, the political parties and their ideas will start to seriously diminish in quality. Think about a business environment, for example, where there is free competition and companies are forced to maintain their high quality standards, because otherwise customers will simply go to another competitor if the prices aren't good, if the quality of the product or service isn't good, or if there is some other negative aspects about the company. Conversely, if there is a significant lack of competition within an industry, in what could be a monopoly, a duopoly, an oligopoly, if a customer is unsatisfied by a product, they will have very little choice to go elsewhere, and will likely have to put up with bad goods or service, or the services being provided to them. What's worse is that if they do complain, the likely outcome will be that their concerns are completely ignored because the company has no incentive to change. To take airlines, for example. If you have in a country 3 airlines, or let's say 2 airlines, and both of them, because they know that they don't have to be that competitive, the services don't have to be in the finest condition, so maybe the food isn't great, the services of the staff isn't great, the pilots, they don't follow these strict procedures to be their absolute best, they can relax a bit, it's always delayed, the flight's always late, it's dirty, they're cutting corners possibly, that's what tends to happen. People tend to not even cut corners, but just don't do the basic things that they would do. You would get fed up with that company. The prices are high, and you go, you know what? No, I'm not flying with them anymore. I will fly to the other company who do the exact same flights. So you go to the other company and you discover that everything is much the same. And you think, well, if they're two of the same and I can't go anywhere, then I'm going to have to just put up with it because I have no other choice. Now imagine for a moment that another company, whether it's grown domestically or comes in from abroad, they step in. They've seen a massive opportunity to undercut these expensive, underperforming airlines. So they come in and they offer cheap discount flights. But the not only that, but the flights are always clean. The people are always professional and they're always on time. What do you think would happen? Obviously, people would go and they would leave these two poorly underperforming airlines and they would start going to the cheaper ones. Now, this cheaper airline starts to gain more of the market share because people are like, hey, it's cheaper, it's better, and it gets me there on time. I'm not stuff you lot, I'm going over to them. So, yeah, they'll get more of a market share. Then what happens is, you would like to hope anyway, and this would be the natural events that would take place, is that the two airlines would either, one, go bust if they didn't change, or two, they would go, right, we need to change because we're losing a lot of money here. This competitors come in and they're just wiping the floor with us. Look at these profits, they've gone down. We're not getting the customers anymore. So they would change and they would improve their standards. The exact same can be applied to a political landscape. If there exists many political parties that cover a range of political philosophies, so let's say you've got a political party, there's like 4 political parties and their main goal is about environmental change. And let's say one of them is not meeting the standards that the people require. So it could be poor policies they're introducing. It could be corruption within the party. They could have changed their stance on something and people don't like it. What the people will do is they will simply change their vote to a different party come the next election. Therefore, in order to maintain and secure their voter base, the party will need to ensure that they are constantly aiming to improve the nation as best as they can with good policies. If, however, there is a significant lack of alternatives, as in the case of only having 2 political parties, you only have one other option, right? So as with the airline, you only have one other option. But this is where it differs in politics than business, because typically if you have, a 2-party state, one party will, it's highly unlikely that both parties will represent one political stance. So if you have a state with 2 parties, one party will represent one political philosophy that will typically be on the right, and the other party will represent the opposite political philosophy on the left. That's the likely scenario. I could be wrong here, but I don't think there is a single example of a democracy where there are 2 parties and they both represent one side of the political spectrum. I could be wrong, but that's not something I've ever come across. And where in a business sense, if the company was not performing up to standards, you would just move to the other business to see what it was like. You would try the other airline. In a political landscape, people naturally will not want to swing to the other side of their political philosophy. It's not a simple case of buying the same product somewhere else because you're getting a completely different product with a different party. So consequently, it means that they'll just stay with the same party, right? Because, well, I'm not going to go over there because I disagree with it, but I'm not happy. So even though they are very disgruntled with the current state of affairs, they'll stay with the same party. And this scenario is exactly what's taking place in the UK. Now, the Conservative Party, they've been in power since 2010. I think it's 2010. But their performance in governing the country has been dismal, quite frankly, and that's probably being very generous to describe that performance. Many would argue, and I would probably agree, that the Conservative Party have drifted away from many of the principles that they would still promote that they stand by. And even though they advertise themselves as being the pro freedom, the pro business, the pro economy party, they're really not anymore. I would have to agree with that. The taxes are higher, the government spending is high, debt is high. Debt is ridiculous, actually. The size of the state is increased, and many would also argue that the social policies have sort of drifted too. On the other side, you have the Labour Party. The Labour Party are there to represent the working man or woman. The working man or woman specifically, as hence the name. A socialist party, they believe, in a bigger state, more taxes, more regulation, etc. The provision of the state should be responsible for providing things, not people responsible for doing it themselves. However, despite not having been in power for roughly 15 years, people have also become very disgruntled with the Labour Party, especially the traditional voters of the Labour Party. So much so, in fact, that in the last election, I think it was the last election, quite a few Labour voters actually switched and voted for the Conservative Party, which is quite strange, especially up north, in North England, where the Labour Party typically has a much stronger base. It's called the Red Wall, is what they call it, because the Labour is red. That's like the colour they're associated with. So why did they get? Why did a lot of people switch to Conservatives during? I think it was the last election, and a lot of the commentary during, and in fact, during the run-up to the election and after the election, about this switch was due to the fact that the Labour Party, as many workers believed, they were no longer representing the working man or woman. In fact, those who switched allegiances had actually said that they were starting to feel they were attacked by this new Labour movement, who, they weren't focused on, the main priority wasn't the working man or woman, but they were focused on getting the younger vote. But anyway, the point is here that you have many people in the Labour Party who are also unhappy with the Labour Party, as Conservative voters are unhappy with the Conservative parties. So, theoretically, what would you do in this situation? Well, naturally, you would vote for the other party that you felt were more accurately representing your views if you had other party options. However, that's not really possible because there aren't any other options available. With the exception of some Labour voters switching to a Conservative, you're practically stuck with what you've got as a Conservative. You're unhappy, but you're not going to vote Labour, so you'll stay with the Conservatives. Likewise with Labour, they're not happy with the Labour Party, but you're not going to go for Conservatives, so you'll stay voting for Labour. Not, as I just said, I did just say that some Labour voters went to the Conservatives, but essentially what you're doing here is you're jumping from one sinking ship straight into the other. It's not really a choice if you're equally as unhappy with the two options that you have. It's essentially just slightly different from your previous choice. So it's bad, it's just bad in a different way. Now I can hear some of you shouting in fact, but you just said earlier on that there are other political parties to vote for So your argument doesn't really have a leg to stand on, because now you're just contradicting yourself. And you'd be correct in saying that, because there are in fact other political parties. However, this is where the title of the episode comes from, the tribalism of party politics. Now, I've seen countless times and I've heard countless arguments made online and in person, and you probably have too. If you don't vote for Labour, then you'll be voting for Conservatives, because any other option is a wasted vote. And it works the other way. If you don't vote for Conservatives, you'll be voting for Labour. And this is what I mean by it being tribal party politics, because people would rather voters not vote for another similar party of a similar political philosophy, simply because they are loyal to their party and they do not want their political nemesis to get into power. And so the tribal analogy is that you have two warring tribes, and you either pick one side or the other, and there's no mixing at all. There's no mixing, there's no give, there's no common ground. You're just constantly at war with each other for no reason. So even if you have another idea, no, because if you vote for them, it's a wasted vote, and Labour will get in, or the Conservatives will get in. In other words, they would rather you not vote based on ideas or even wanting a change, but want you to vote on party loyalty and denying the other side a vote. So regardless of the policies that the party introduce, or however bad they are, or no matter how many scandals and cases of blatant corruption that are brought to the fore, even if the people themselves admit that these things are bad, they will still vote for the party. They're willing to excuse all these malpractices. They're effectively giving the politicians the green light to do all these bad things I just mentioned. And why? Because it's the common belief amongst the population that voting for these challenger parties, as I like to call them, is a futile attempt to bring about change, because they believe that they will never win, and you'll just be, as this is the excuse that's always giving, splitting the vote. Don't split the vote. Ignore the corruption. Ignore the lies. Ignore the incompetence. Ignore the whole political circus that's laid bare on your TV, and vote for them. Otherwise, the other side will get in, because the new ideas will never win. That's just wishful thinking. How many times have you heard something similar, especially splitting the vote? If someone says you will split the vote, that is what they mean. They want you to ignore everything, and they want you to stick with their party. No matter what, you stick to the party. Now, I imagine many of you listening to this, if not all, have common sense to fill the rafters, and you'll be listening to my vituperative words, and you'll think, people who say that stuff, these people have no vision. I mean, they must be really living in a shoebox of reality. And if you are, I agree. Because these people are so ignorant to the idea of change. They have no idea about the role that time plays in the coming of change. I mean, in the history of humankind, and in fact, I'm being very ignorant in that statement by saying just humankind. In the history of Earth, of life on Earth, of everything, change is constant. But quite often, and when referring to the study of humans from a biological perspective and maybe from an anthropologic perspective, change doesn't just happen overnight. As I mentioned at the start, and hopefully now you can understand the need for my long introduction of our political system today. Our political system is a product of change. Can you imagine trying to say to someone in the Middle Ages that the king in the 21st century will be nothing more than a figure to British culture and will have no power in the governing of the country whatsoever? You could imagine the shock on their face. And the king's face, I might add. However, the change did happen. It just took time. So if you think, I want you to imagine for a second that people had the same attitude to voting now, or, these people who are very tribal in their voting, they say they had the same attitude to voting now as they did at the start of, let's say the 19th century. What would still be the same? Well, slavery would still be in existence in the UK. Women wouldn't have the vote. Colonialism would still be practiced. The East India Company would still be operating. If they didn't go bankrupt. Again, these changes happened. They just took time. But more than that, they didn't just take time. It took people who saw ideas, who had ideas and thought, no, I want change. We're going to vote for this change. This change needs to happen. And that's what was required. People who were not thinking about parties or people, they were thinking about ideas, and they were making those votes. And this is why the votes came. So it really is bewildering to me that many people who are unable to conceive the idea of looking beyond a 10-year horizon of political change, how can they? I don't understand how they can live in such a short-sighted view on things. I mean, how do they think anything was ever achieved? I mean, maybe they don't think about it more contextually, which would make sense. And it's difficult for them to get a grander view of the idea of political change or just change in society. I don't know. I'd love to get an answer. But anyway, as a consequence, it means that people will still be voting for these two political giants, Conservative or Labour. These two giant underperforming parties. And we're stuck in this negative feedback loop of no change and poor government, which is completely wrong. And it speaks, I think, for the ambition of this country, how little ambition we have. Because it's ideas that are powerful, that bring about change, and that have made the world what it is today. Ideas shape people, and it's the ideas that make someone great, or they can make someone bad. But the point is, it's ideas. People don't make the ideas make people. And there's a quote. I'm not too sure who the quote comes from, but the quote is, and many of you might have heard this: great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. And I think this is particularly relevant in Britain. And I'm not saying our political discussion is entirely void of ideas, because that's simply not true. But too much of the discussion is around the two political parties and people in those parties, and not enough surrounding the ideas that are needed to fix this country, because there are many problems and it needs fixed. And it's only if you're looking to these parties for hope, you are unfortunately poorly mistaken. It's ideas that will bring about the change. And of course, one reason why new ideas aren't being thought about, or some clear problems aren't being discussed, is because when you have a two-state party, some topics become political suicide. I mean, politicals will not touch certain topics. Why? Because politicians become more concerned with self-preservation of their career, than they are about making an actual change. And when you have only two main parties, it means that important decisions will never get spoken about, because there's no one else brave enough or who actually cares more about ideas and change than their careers. And in the rare instance that there is someone within either of the parties who's willing to attempt to make change, they get sidelined and put into the political backseat. So it's really difficult for unconventional or new ideas to even spring up, because they can be so easily suppressed. No one wants to talk about the topics that might lose their support in the next election. And this is why it's so easy for important policies to never get spoken about, and just small minor things that are being introduced or being hot in the debate and on our TVs. And we're all thinking, this is nothing to do with what needs to be done. Why are we not talking about the really important issues that this country is facing? Why are we talking about these small things? And the reason being is, of course, as I said, they don't want to talk about it. And there's no other options, there's no new parties to challenge them. It's just these two. There's no one else who can gain enough support to say, hey, what about this? We're going to change this. There's no one doing that, because we have people who are in that negative feedback loop of only voting for the Conservatives because they don't want Labour, or only voting for Labour because they don't want Conservatives, and they won't look at other parties, even if they might consider these other parties to be worthy of a vote. Hey, they've got some really good ideas, but if I vote for them, I'm just going to split the vote, which means the Tories are going to get in another time, or the Tories might think, these politicians are quite lousy, but I quite like what this party has to say. I quite like the ideas that they're bringing to the fore, but if I vote for them, then it's just going to be less votes for the Conservatives and more for Labour, and we don't want Labour to get in because that would be the end. But the reality is, the Conservatives have been poor. They've been very poor, very, very poor. So what about the parties that do exist? What about new parties? What's stopping them from coming up? Why don't they come up? So even if we momentarily ignore the situation I've just described, other parties can actually still attract votes, or new parties can actually be created. After all, there are, as I said, there are 406 parties, so parties can be created, and that's true. But if you ignore the devolved parties who don't even have people standing in the elections outside of their respective countries, if a new party wants to seriously consider competing with the two existing giants, it's actually a lot more difficult than you might think. There are, in essence, high barriers to entry, and in fact, this can once again be likened to a business environment. So as I mentioned before, when we were saying the only about the monopolies or the duopolies, and I use the example of a new entrant coming in and disrupting the airlines. Let's say, for example, that there were barriers to entry into that industry, and the barriers to entry were simply the government will just block it. They will not allow new entrants to come in. That means that the monopolies are entirely able to operate without any concern of any of the competition. And that is because the government have said, no, we're going to protect these two companies. That's it, just these two. Those are called barriers to entry, and they are protecting a duopoly, or maybe if it was one, a monopoly. And by the way, whether it is a monopoly or a duopoly, in a completely free market, they will never last long. The only time a monopoly or a duopoly can last long and can compete long enough is if there is some government involvement where there are some barriers to entry. So barriers to entry is very important. If you have high barriers, it means that it's very difficult for new entrants to challenge. And this is, annoyingly, funnily enough, this is also the case with politics itself. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but there are higher barriers to entry if you want to become, a party that is seriously challenging the status quo. Because I don't know what the rules are or the requirements are to start a new party, but you can start a party with the intention of it not being very big or challenging the parties. I think one of the most famous ones of the sort of joke, the jokey parties is the what are they called? The Monster Raving Loony Party, and I think his name is like Spaghetti Head or something. And he runs every year, but his policies are completely ludicrous. But he runs every year. They are an official party, but he's not really competing. So anyone can register. But if you're, like I said, if you're trying to compete seriously, then it's completely different. Now, love him or hate him, and I would argue that a lot of people do indeed hate him. One thing that Nigel Farage highlighted when he was running with UKIP and later the Brexit Party, which is now the Reform Party, was that he highlighted that it was very difficult for the parties to, really get going, to really gain traction and support, because the rules around funding that had been set up made it very difficult for that campaign to be maintained. Now, people's reactions to this would be likely good. I didn't like him anyway. I'm glad he struggled. I'm glad he didn't get in, because it would be really bad if he got in. I don't know. However, if those barriers exist for him, it also means that it exists for every other party, and other parties will struggle to break through, to become serious contenders in our political landscape, if they want. And what that effectively does, it secures the competition from either side. So the Conservatives don't have much competition, and Labour also don't have much competition. And what will eventually start happening, and in fact was what has started to happen, is that these parties will start to churn out the same sort of ideas, just done in a slightly different way, or masked in a different way, because they have nothing else to really compete with. And if they want to ensure that they're going to keep their votes, and I mean, we have a portion of swing voters in the United Kingdom who they swing from one side to the other, and so you sort of keep the policies not too dissimilar from what you were doing before in order to maintain these swing voters. However, at the same time, you've got Labour who are trying to attract the younger people, so they'll cater towards the younger generation, and the Conservatives, not wanting to miss out on these young votes, they will also start to do similar things to what the Labour Party are doing, but maybe masking it in a different way. I mean, it's not identical. They're not copying it. They're not painting both sheds green, but they're calling it blue and they're calling it green. No. They are doing different things, but the idea is that in order to, for example, capture the younger vote, or to try and get as many of the swing voters as possible, they'll copy what the other party is doing that's successful. And so you have this phenomenon where, even though they're opposite parties of opposite ends, ideas sort of start to merge a little bit, and you start to have the same things being churned out and laid bare in front of you. And this is terrible, because if you're getting the same thing, there's no real idea creation. There's nothing different here. We're all doing the same thing. There's no challenge to the ideas. We need that challenge. And of course, the other issue is with the politicians, with the parties, who, you're, by only having two parties, you're missing out on an incredible amount of talent that could be there, in trying to get into politics, trying to, maybe starting up another party, but they simply can't, because of the barriers, because of the tribalism of voters. And so what you'll be left with, and again, what we have, and I think most people would agree with this statement because it's just so true, you have the most mediocre politicians ever. And it will get to a point, actually, where the poor politicians will start to negatively impact people's lives, because they're not really in it. First of all, they're not in it for to actually bring about change, to actually do something good for the company. They see being a politician as a way to access more benefits that other people don't get. So that's where the nepotism will start to come in. And this is what I said this before, how a lack of competition can breed corruption, because these politicians who are they're terrible politicians, they're no character, and they have their goals aren't pure in any sense of the word, and so with the nepotism, they'll maybe use their position to help some of their friends. I think a good example of this was David Cameron when they had the biofuel, and it was essentially just a way for him to siphon off money to his friends. You had during COVID, we had the example of the mask contracts. Again, a product of nepotism, using and abusing your power. And there are so many other examples that could be drawn upon. And this is what I mean by, after a while, having a protected sphere of two parties means that you certainly will not get the best politicians, and potential good politicians will be sidelined. They'll never reach the top, and instead you're encouraging malpractices by these people who want to get wealthy quickly. I mean, how many examples in the UK and especially in the US have we seen where politicians have been in power or they've been a politician, for 20 years, and they've made millions. I mean, they've made millions, and you think politicians don't get paid that much. So how have you managed to accrue, a real estate empire, and your net worth has increased by like 600%? There are these. You look at these politicians; they've stepped back and they're worth like 70 million, and you're like, that's not right. Some of them come from wealthy families, fair enough, but not all of them. And so people's lives, it will actually start to impact people's lives negatively, and we're certainly seeing that now. So, and it just reinforces the idea of why we need parties to challenge the status quo. And I think another byproduct of having this tribal, this tribalism in the UK is that with ideas not being created and you only having Labour versus Tory, so it's not a battle of ideas, it's a battle of parties. People will not think about ideas objectively anymore. And by that, what I really mean is, if you have something and it's considered to be a conservative policy, and someone who votes Labour, they may well agree to some degree with some of the policies of that idea. But the result is, because simply it's considered to be a conservative policy, they will disagree with it 100%. And likewise with Conservative, whenever I do draw an example, I'm not just pointing at one. It's applicable for both sides. So people just argue something, they disagree with it on the simple basis that because it came from them, I can't agree with it, no matter what. If my party said it, I would agree with it. Because it's their party, I disagree with it. So ideas aren't even being really processed. Ideas become associated with parties. It's the party first, and then it's the idea. But it's not even, do you prioritize ideas? It's has my party come up with that idea, yes or no? If it has, great, I'll back it. If it hasn't, I completely disagree with it. So, the ideas then are not thought about, and equally people become polarized for no reason other than the fact of their political affiliation. So many of the younger people will probably know this, and if you don't know this, or you're a bit older and you haven't experienced this, let me explain that online now, you'll see a lot of people, or as well when you are sort of like on the dating scene and you're meeting new people and you're doing it online, or you see in people's bios, and people say things like, "If you're a Tory, do not speak to me," or Tories only, no Labour voters. And you think, what is going on here? Why is people's whole personality, their life is dictated, the people they surround themselves by is dictated on a political party they vote for? And this is what I mean by the polarization of people. You're surrounding yourself with people of the same ideas. You don't want anyone to challenge your ideas. You don't even want a different, group of thought. You want the same people who agree the exact same things with you all the time. So much so that if you have someone who has a different opinion to you, you won't even speak to them. You don't even want to hear a single thing. And this is the outcome of a two-party state, the tribal two-party state. People use the parties and they allow it to dictate their life, as opposed to if you were to have ideas, if you were to have many different parties, and you were to have ideas that floated around, you're not going to have people saying, oh, if you think this, and list every single idea. No. But what it will do is if you say, well, I think this, and this party most closely represents me. And because you're not just loyal to one party, you can think, well, okay, I'd agree with you on some things, I disagree with you on some other things. That is a much healthier way to live your life. And the other thing as well, of course, is that if you have people who are so disgruntled with the system, the only way for the change for change to really come, because it can't come through parliamentary needs, how else does it come? I think we all really know, the answer to that. If there's no other way for change, there's only two parties. You cannot change the status quo. How else does it happen? Well, you could argue, look what happened in Germany, or look what happened in the French Revolution, for example. If they didn't do what they did, it would never have changed otherwise. And you don't want that. You want people to feel like, not even feel like, you want people to have the choice to change things. But in the current state of affairs, that's just simply not happening. And when you have that scenario where people don't think about ideas objectively and they're just arguing or disagreeing because of party loyalty, it really does. I mean, effectively what it does is it breeds stupidity, right? Because people aren't thinking. You might have an issue, you might have a problem that the country's facing, or there's an issue, a social issue. And if you really want to understand that issue, you will have to properly think about it and dissect maybe the different options, who it impacts, how it impacts it, what the solutions are. But if someone comes with what could be a very viable solution to the problem, and they put it forward, and you go, no, wrong, disagree with that, that's a really stupid idea, that's just a very Labour idea that you said, and I think it's rubbish. Or conversely, if someone from the Conservative, or who is a Conservative, and they say that, and you think, nope, disagree with that, stupid, rubbish, never, that's why would you ever say that, what a stupid idea. You haven't actually thought about what they're saying. You've just instantly disagreed because you don't like that party, you don't like their ideas, you don't like anything to do with them. And so it's just an argument for the sake of it, and there's no real understanding of what the problem is. People are not able to fully comprehend what the issue is or what the solutions are, because their whole argument is based on if the idea comes from one political party or another. So that's, the very pessimistic sort of summary of what's happening. And it's no exaggeration to say that at the moment that is exactly what's happening. However, that doesn't mean to say that there isn't hope, because I think there is. There are some parties, in fact, who are growing in influence and are growing in popularity. In fact, they do like these polls where they see, what are they polling at? in the current. And if they were to have an election now, like, what's the vote that they would win? And there are two. I would probably say there are two parties at the moment who are challenging the status quo of having of the Conservatives and the Labour. Now, of course, before I do go into them, you still have the Liberal Democrats. I mean, the Liberal Democrats they're quite a well-established party, but they don't really put up any meaningful opposition. And quite frankly, the last leader of the party that I could think of is Nick Clegg. I don't actually know anyone from the Liberal Democrats. They've never actually formed. The Liberal Democrats, as we know them today, have never actually formed a government, as far as I can remember. The only time a majority government, that is, the only time they were in power is when they formed the minor coalition with the Conservatives. In 2010, you had David Cameron and Nick Clegg. But apart from that, I don't believe so. If you think about it, the United Kingdom have only ever had the Whigs, the Tories, and Labour as ruling governments. I mean, how is that? That speaks for itself, I think, in terms of the state of politics. So, anyway, the two main new challenger parties that I think are throwing their hat into the ring. On the right, you have the Reform Party, and they grew out from the Brexit Party, who was founded by Nigel Farage. And then on the left, you have the SDP, the Social Democratic Party. Now, I would say Social Democratic Party are on the left. However, they're not as big as Reform in terms of the popularity. I think recently Reform just polled in at 13%. But what the SDP aim to do, and I touched on this before, when you had those disgruntled workers who felt like the Labour Party no longer represented the working man or woman, they were, catering more towards the younger people. Their only other choice was to go to the Conservatives, because the Conservatives were seen as a more of a pro-British party, and they weren't necessarily attacking the working man. Now, the SDP have seen an opportunity here where the working man and woman is not actually getting fully represented, but they're a socialist party. And so they've gone, right, well, this is an opportunity. This is a gap in the political landscape for us to capture the market. And I think they're struggling. Or they're not struggling, they're growing, I should say. But it's a new party. It's a new challenging party, and a challenger party. And I think a lot of those people, those swing voters, or those ones who feel like they're no longer being represented, that's certainly one for them. And on the other side, you have Reform, and they are essentially the party who are positioning themselves as, basically doing what the Conservatives are not doing. They're fixing the real issues, that what they see as the real issues in the country, as are the SDP, what they think are the real issues in the country. So you have two new challenger parties. I don't know when SDP was formed, actually, but this is good. I think this is very beneficial to our political landscape, because what it's doing is it's putting pressure on the two incumbent parties to slowly make change. And at the moment, I would say that the argument that they're not going to get into power by the next election, if someone were to say, yeah, but they won't win the next election, and therefore the other side, whether it's Tory or Labour, they might win. That statement in isolation is true. Let's say for a moment that Reform UK were growing in popularity on the right, and they took away many of the voters from the Conservatives. Yes, that would mean that Conservatives have less of the vote. And yes, that would likely mean that Labour get more vote. Okay? However, what that actually means is that people are coming round to the idea that, hey, this is a new party. These people are actually saying what we think needs to be done. They're representing us. They're doing what needs to be done. They're not engaged in these silly policies that are just not helping anyone. And so this is something that I think could be a very important development in British politics, and the same on this, and it's the same with the SDP. They could capture a new vote of the working class, and what this could also do, in fact, is it could spark a new sort of not a revolution. It could spark a new political age where new parties are actually throwing their hats into the ring because they're seeing, well, it's no longer as difficult to get the vote anymore, and the consequence of that would be more ideas would start to be exchanged and thought of and spoken about, and this is where the problems, I think, would start to get solved in this country. And I think if you look around at the politicians now, and you think, even though I said this before, I think it's worth reiterating, there's no personality in British politics whatsoever. I mean, look at the two leaders. We have Rishi Sunak, and you have Keir Starmer. Now, Rishi Sunak is... I've never seen someone who looks so... not uncomfortable, just unsure what to do, what to say. Everything seems forced. I mean, I look at his character and you see him speak there, and there's no charisma behind his words or his actions or his body language. I mean, if he were to be a food, he would be bran flakes, I think. Because, I mean, you just watch these videos, and so many of these videos come out, and you just think, is this really what we've got to represent the people? Someone who can't use a hammer properly, or who goes to a building site and he's wearing like £600 shoes. Just very tone deaf towards the people. Can't pour a pint. Not that that should reflect on him as a person, as policies, but just those sort of things where if you're going to try and do it, and you're going to try and prove that you have a personality, do it right, or be able to do it. He can't do these things. And then you've got Keir Starmer. I don't think that guy... The guy's, what kind of a personality is that? He's so boring. He doesn't inspire any confidence whatsoever. He just kind of and the thing is, he's not even that active in his opposition. He kind of just sits there and he just waits for the Conservatives to, do another mistake somewhere, and then he was like, look what they've done. But he's got no policies himself. So in terms of charisma and personality, it's seriously lacking. And then I'm not even going to go into the cabinet ministers, because they're much the same. I don't even know. I mean, I know more of the Conservatives because obviously they're the ones in power at the moment. I don't even know many of the Labour, and I would wager that they're much the same, carbon copies of each other. And I remember when David Cameron and George Osborne, when they were in power, David Cameron was in power, and they were just the same people in different fonts. I mean, they sounded the same. They went to the same school. They went to universities together. They looked quite similar, and if you shut your eyes, you would struggle to tell the difference between the two of them. So the UK has got a personality problem. The only person I would argue that was somewhat interesting, and no, in fact, he was very interesting and very funny, was Boris Johnson. He was a funny character, wasn't a good Prime Minister, but he was funny, and he had charisma, and he, people laughed at him, with him and at him, mind, but, they still did. So, my point is here that, I encourage people to vote for these other parties and ignore the ignore the split the vote argument, because I just think it's just social. It's short-sighted. It's incorrect. It lacks ambition, and what it results in is the sorry state of politics today. So ignore that argument whatsoever. And do you know what? The other reason you should ignore that, not just from a political, development, but I mean, these are the things. When people say that, this is exactly what these politicians want them to say. They don't even need to say it themselves anymore. People are doing their bidding for them. If the more people that they can get on this tribal war between parties, the safer they are really in their jobs, because they have less competition. They've got their loyal base who will never leave them, and so great, fantastic. We might not get into power, but I've still got my job in my constituency. They barely disagree with each other really. So a lot of them, you wouldn't even be able to tell what they stand for. So they've got people doing their bidding for them by arguing that, don't vote for anyone else. Keep on voting for your local MP, because if not, then the other MP will get in, and you don't want that to happen, and you don't want the other party to win a majority. So ignore that. Vote for something different. Vote for change, and you'll see change come eventually. Yes, it will take time, but you'll see change come. And I think if I were to maybe draw another example of where it's quite tribal, aside from not aside from the United Kingdom, obviously in terms of Parliament, in terms of Westminster, you've got Conservative and Labour. In Stormont, in Northern Ireland, you've got Sinn Féin and DUP, and it's the complete same. People will not vote for anyone else who are so much more sensible than either of these parties, because they're so worried that if I split the vote away from DUP, or if I split the vote from Sinn Féin, then the others are going to win. They're going to get a majority, and we can't have that, because if we have that, then we're doomed. And in Northern Ireland, you have parties now who are seriously challenging these parties with some fantastic policies, some good ideas. They're trying to really just get past this whole Catholic Protestant issue, and they're just not getting the opportunities because people are that tribal in their voting that they're stuck in a negative feedback loop. And in fact, it's probably worse there, because Stormont isn't even operational. I mean, for the past 5-6 years, I'd love to know how many weeks they've actually been open as a parliament and have been actively governing the country. It'll be very low, I can assure you that. So it's not just a problem unique with Conservatives, Labour. It's happening in Northern Ireland, and it's also happening around the world. I mean, if you look at America, for example, America is a two-party state. I mean, it literally is a two-party. And, in the UK, I say it's a two-party state because it's a lot of the other parties don't really have much of a voice. But in the States, it quite literally is a two-party state. And the difference between some of the Democrats and the Republicans is razor thin. There's not much difference. And to be honest, a lot of the time, they are just the exact same. They believe the same thing because it's, after all, they're looking after themselves, right? And if it means that, well, we'll have only two parties, but we can be secure in our jobs, fine, we'll use our contacts, we'll use our nepotism to make ourselves rich, and we'll make off like bandits. It suits them a lot better if there's less people for them to compete with. So bear that in mind the next time someone says that to you. Or if you are someone who believes that you should never split the vote, maybe you should bear that in mind as well. If you really want to see change, how do you think change has come? It's not come by people sticking with the same party, or not voting for someone else just because you don't want the other side to get in. As they say, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So that's how I will leave you with those final thoughts. And when it does come to the next election, please vote for change. It does sound like by the way, that sounds like a very that sounds like a politician. Vote for me. I'm the person of change. But vote for something different, because we'll be stuck here otherwise, and it will never end. So that concludes episode number 3. I hope you enjoyed this one. Hopefully in the next episode I will be doing something completely different, away from politics. I feel like the last two, well, the second one wasn't too political, but this one was obviously just about politics. The first one was somewhat political. Well, it was about history, actually. Well, so the next one probably won't be about politics, because I like to just change things up and be random and keep everyone on their feet. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Do rate it 5 stars, please. Even if you don't think it's 5 stars, rate it 5 stars. No, I'm joking. But do leave a rating. Do react to the comments. I'm also on social media. You just have to search Rambling On Twitter or Instagram. I don't have a YouTube page yet, but I will be creating a YouTube page, and I will be uploading these. So do follow those as well. If you are new, welcome. If you are a returning listener, thank you very much for listening to this new episode. And I look forward to creating the next one.